This is a very grave situation. What's been happening in Israel, and what's been happening in Gaza and Palestine, with the whole war between Israel and Hamas. And I'm just going to lead with my most shocking take, and then I'll dive into what's been happening with the conflict. There's a lot of people saying, Israel has the right to exist, or, from the river to the sea, we should kill all the Jews, or whatever. Like, you're hearing a lot of rhetoric kind of on both ends of that spectrum there, right? Some people saying Israel should exist, and some are saying that all the Jews should be exterminated. We're trying to point to historical things, right? Historical precedents by saying, oh, the Israelites have been there for like 4,000 years, or the Israelites were there 4,000 years ago, so they have a right to the land. Or, I don't know, the Palestinians were there 100 years ago, so they have a right to the land, and their land was stolen from them or whatever. A whole lot of people arguing back and forth, right, about this whole situation. And considering what Hamas has done, right, to Israel, I'm gonna say this. Literally none of that matters at this point. None of it matters. And here's why. You can interpret Hamas's terror attack against Israel as an act of war to a degree. Now, it was terrorism, to be fair, but a lot of other things where it's drone strikes, it's sending in, troops and militants to fire at people, even though, yes, they are, aiming at and targeting civilians, and they are doing horrific things to those civilians. It's the type of thing that, a warring country will do. An enemy nation would do in war if they were barbaric enough, which these people who are fighting at the behest of Hamas do certainly seem to be barbaric. And here's the thing about war. And this is, mutually declared, right? Because Israel has also said, we're at a state of war. Here's the thing about war. When you go to war, you forfeit your right to your land. There's never been a nation that has at least been taken seriously that said, you know what, we're going to go to war with you. They go to war, they lose the war, and they lose the land, and they're like, oh no, you're stealing our land. How dare you? You never hear any serious country say that. Everyone understands that when you decide to go to war, you risk losing, and you risk being subjugated and conquered. That is, unfortunately, the nature of war. There are a lot of people who are acting like the only way to take land is to buy it. Not true. It is one thing if you're just completely taken over, just someone just goes over to you and just completely wipes you out, and you didn't even do anything to you. Now, I know people are going to start quibbling about this in the comment section, maybe, but I don't think that's the situation here. It's certainly not the situation in the immediate history of what's been happening here, because it wasn't like Israel was, running around, burning citizens alive in Palestine, right? Like, they weren't doing that. But Hamas just decided to do that on their own. This attack, literally everyone's been saying, was completely unprovoked. So, when it comes to, free Palestine, here's the problem. We're looking at what free Palestine means right now. Free Palestine means terrorist attacks and horrific things being done to Jews and to Israeli citizens. That's what free Palestine means. You hear people chanting from the river to the sea, whatever. That means literally kill all of the Jews and wipe out Israel as a state. That's what that means. And I think it's pretty ironic that these people who are saying these types of things are the same ones decrying violence, right? And calling for peace. Like, this is the first time I've ever seen a movement of people who love peace supporting terrorism. Like, it's such a strange and surreal thing for me to see. So I did want to get that first take out of the way. And say, I will be going into all of the history eventually. I still have some research to do on that, but my conclusion has basically been that none of the history matters, because Hamas, which represents Palestine, right? It does represent Palestine because, Hamas does run the Palestinian government. Basically, Palestine has declared war on Israel. That's quite literally what's happened here. So by declaring war, you forfeit all your right to your land if you lose. So if Israel were to decide, hey, we're going to beat Hamas, we're going to completely take over Palestine and we're just going to make everything Israel, they would have a right to do so. You can't whine and complain about, oh, it being stolen land. If you didn't want them to steal the land, you shouldn't have declared war with them. Like, that's just the fact of the matter. So that's generally my take on the immediate situation. But that's a very macro approach. That's at a very macro and highly elevated level. Because there's some things individually that have been happening here that I did want to point out. And, some of this is going to be critical of the state of Israel. Yes, I am someone who does think that Israel has the right to exist. I am someone who does want Israel to win this war. But, this doesn't mean that Israel's perfect, right? So, you have to criticize people when they do things wrong, even if they're people that you like. And even to be fair, I'm not even the biggest fan of the state of Israel. I've never been the biggest fan of the state of Israel. I've just always supported their right to exist. So there is a difference between the two. But I did want to take a look at a few things, right? A few things that not a lot of people are highlighting. I am seeing more people talking about this whole situation now that more time has gone on. But one thing is Israel's siege of Gaza. So Israel decided to basically completely seal off Gaza. And by the way, this meant that no food, no water, and no electricity was to go into Gaza at all. That's basically what that amounted to. And I didn't really hear a lot of people kind of talking about this situation when it started. Let's see here. But now, like a few days ago, the UN has started to kind of condemn this siege, right? And, I kind of do understand why Israel would do a siege of Gaza. I've heard it said that this is in large part because Israel plans on doing a ground offensive in Gaza against Hamas. And Hamas has been using the Palestinians who live in Gaza City as human shields. They have a lot of tunnels underneath the civilian areas in Gaza City. And so if Israel is going to invade Gaza City to take out Hamas, they're going to be at a severe disadvantage. So by starving out Hamas and depriving them of food and of water and all of that stuff, then it'll be easier for them to defeat Hamas. At the very least, they're not going to be fighting people who are at full fighting force, if that makes sense. They might get ambushed, but they might be ambushed by starving soldiers. And so I think, of course, you're going to find that to be a more promising and positive, proposition versus, going into enemy territory where you definitely don't have the home court advantage, where, a lot of your soldiers could be abducted. There's just a lot of advantages there that Hamas has that Israel doesn't have. So I do understand why they might do this. But there are multiple problems with this. I wish I had this link pulled up, but one said that the hospitals in Gaza only had about 4 days worth of electricity when the siege started. Now, at my time of recording this video, the siege has been going on for about 7 to 8 days, which means that all the hospitals in Gaza are most likely completely out of electricity and have been out of electricity for about 3 days or so. So that, I think, is an issue. While I do support Israel, doing what they can to defeat Hamas, I think one of the objectives should be to free the Palestinians from the rule and reign of Hamas, because it is true, right? I think somewhere between 40 and 50 or 55% of Palestinians support Hamas. That still leaves a good, even if we're being pessimistic, 45% of Palestinians who do not support Hamas. So I don't think that we should punish all the Palestinians for, the terrible activities that Hamas has decided to partake in. And it's not just, me from a pro-life position saying, oh, it's really, really awful to see Palestinians suffering, not just Israelis suffering. It's not just that. I looked it up, and a complete siege seems to be, from what I can tell, against the Geneva Conventions, at least how Israel is carrying this out. So this comes from, who was this? The International Committee of the Red Cross, right? They posted this kind of talking about the rules of war or whatever. And they have one thing that says, what are rules on sieges? So here's what they wrote. Sieges often have grave consequences for large numbers of civilians. In order to protect civilians, there are important rules in IHL. Crucially, civilians must be allowed to evacuate from a besieged area. Now, they have allowed them to evacuate the besieged area, but that only came days after the siege began. Neither the besieging force nor the force under siege may force them to remain against their will. Now, I have heard some semi-confirmed reports that Hamas is barricading their civilians within Gaza. I've heard it said also that the border between Gaza and Egypt is actually blocked on the Gazan side, not on the Egyptian side, which is most likely the fault of Hamas. So it is possible that Hamas is indeed, preventing the civilians from leaving, on their own free will. But let's continue to what this next paragraph has to say. Sieges may only be directed exclusively against an enemy's armed forces, and it is absolutely prohibited to shoot or attack civilians fleeing a besieged area. Now, on this note here, this is one of the main issues I think exists with Israel's siege, if we're talking about Israel following the formal rules of war, because, this is not exclusively affecting the armed forces of Hamas. As a matter of fact, this is actually affecting a whole lot of Palestinian civilians within Gaza. Now, I do think that you might be able to quibble with. I do think you might be able to quibble with the wordplay somewhat legitimately, because it's not directed against the civilians. The point is not to starve the civilians at all. The point is to starve out the Hamas terrorists who are living within Gaza City. So you could kind of quibble with the wordplay there. Also, it says here in the sentence that it is absolutely prohibited to shoot or attack civilians fleeing a besieged area. They did do this at one point. I think it wasn't on purpose. They were bombing an area that was, I think there were some underground tunnels or something that Israel was trying to bomb. That was run by Hamas. And I think they later basically apologized for it and said that they wouldn't do that again. They only bombed the fleeing Gazans once when they were fleeing Gaza City, which I'm sure is no comfort to the people who were bombed while trying to leave Gaza City, to be fair. But that is something that happened. I think it's fair to point that out, even as someone who supports Israel and wants Israel to win. Now, to continue, it says, in addition, parties must comply with all the rules governing the conduct of hostilities. Constant care must be taken to spare civilians when putting a city under siege and attacking military objectives in the besieged area. Now, yes, Israel did go out and say, flee Gaza, right? Run away, because we are going to invade Gaza City. And I think that we've actually gotten some indications that Israel has wanted to do a ground offensive in Gaza way before today, like at least for like 3 or 4 days, but there's still over 1 million Palestinians within Gaza City. So I think that's one of the main reasons why they've refrained from diving in at this particular moment. Moving on. All feasible precautions must be taken to avoid or minimize incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians. So this is all, so this is kind of repeats the previous sentence. Basically saying, don't attack the civilians, don't hurt the civilians, don't starve the civilians, only target your enemies, which I think Israel hasn't really done a great job of doing, because to be honest, Hamas lives inside the entire city. They literally rule the entire city. They're basically the police, the government. Hamas literally controls the government of Palestine as well as the government of Gaza. So it is hard to try and starve out the Hamas terrorists without, incidentally starving out some of the civilians as well. Now, there has been pressure against Israel due to the siege, and so they have decided to kind of, ease up on their siege, right? So an Israeli official confirmed that they resumed water supply to Gaza. This at least partially alleviates the siege that they were performing before. This siege, by the way, was originally called a complete siege because they were besieging them completely, preventing anything from getting in. But they've since changed their mind, I think in large part due to international pressure. True international pressure, as Joe Biden would say. And yeah, has decided to resume water supply to Gaza. But that's not the entire story. Now, Hamas has said that Gaza's water supply is still cut off, even though Israel says that they supplied water to Gaza. So what's going on here? Which side is lying? Is Hamas lying in saying that Israel has not supplied water to Gaza, or is Israel lying in saying that they did supply water to Gaza? Well, I think when it comes to, claims of, giving things to the Palestinians who are living in Gaza and whether or not the civilians are receiving it, you have to consider the natural pattern of how Hamas has ruled over these civilians. For example, we do have this report from the IDF with pictures as proof showing that the Hamas terrorists have been using first aid kits from UNICEF that were supposed to be provided to the civilians living in Gaza for humanitarian reasons. So here we have an example, right, of Hamas stealing things that were supposed to be for the goodness and the benefit of the Palestinians living in Gaza. But that's not all. Now, while the UN RWA did delete this, Twitter thread, they did report, and it's been apparently confirmed, that Hamas has been basically going in and stealing some supplies that have since been provided to the Gazans since Israel has decided to ease up on their siege. So I think that this begs the question. When Hamas says that Israel has not provided water to the people of Gaza, should we believe them? I would frankly not put it past the government of Hamas to damage the water supply system so that it's completely impossible for Gaza to ever get water running in their previously laid down pipes ever again. Now, I will say that that's a conspiracy theory. I will admit that I don't necessarily have proof of that claim, but I do think it makes sense. It fits the pattern because every single time people have tried to give things to the citizens of Gaza for humanitarian reasons and for the benefit of the people, Hamas has a track record of, trying to steal that stuff. So, when it comes to letting up on the siege, I think, unfortunately, it will be very, very difficult for Israel to restore everything to the Palestinians that was previously lost because, frankly, I suspect that Hamas has sabotaged some of those lines, which really sucks for the Palestinians. And I think that all the more hastens the necessity for Israel to win this war quickly, because if Israel decides to take over all of this land, then that means they'll be able to build up this infrastructure more than they would be allowed to otherwise. Now, there is more to this story here because Israel has since been telling the Gazans to flee. And I think I did mention this earlier. Now, the UN has been very mad about telling the citizens of Gaza to flee, which honestly makes no sense to me. Because, Hamas has been operating out of here. Israel has been bombing buildings that Hamas has been operating out of, but those buildings often include civilians because Hamas has been using human shields in order to increase civilian casualties and paint Israel in a bad light with the PR move, which frankly, that is one of the few things that Hamas has done that kind of makes sense strategically. Although the problem is, of course, you're basically killing your own people, which is ludicrous and ridiculous and honestly horrific as well. But, as Israel told the Palestinians to flee Gaza, they did incidentally bomb them. Now, I think they only did this once, from my understanding. And the reason why they launched these bombs is because nearby, I think it was the road to Rafah, if I'm not mistaken. If I'm mistaken, definitely correct me in the comment section. But as the civilians were on the road to Rafah trying to flee and leave Gaza City, nearby, there was like a bunker or some sort of underground tunnel where Hamas militants were operating out of. And so Israel decided to bomb that place. But they didn't account for, all of those civilians who were nearby, and they ended up kind of getting hit. I don't think there were any direct hits on civilians, but it was close enough to cause some injuries, I believe. So I believe Israel apologized for that, and that's something that they shouldn't have done. They probably should have thought through that a little bit more. So that's kind of, my overview, and I think of the most egregious things that Israel has done. I know there are complaints of people who are pro-Israel in this conflict by saying, "Oh, you're blind to the things that Israel's doing wrong." Well, no, I'm not. I'm trying to be objective and take a look at things, as objectively as possible. Well, I do understand why Israel would try to besiege Gaza City. I think it actually would probably cost fewer civilian lives if they did a full-on ground assault with no siege, because then you can more accurately target and pinpoint the militants rather than the civilians. Because you besiege a whole city, and let's say you kill all the terrorists, but then all of the civilians die as well. Versus if you go in, building by building, tunnel by tunnel, then you can kind of pick off the terrorists one by one or group by group, versus affecting and punishing all of the civilians. And of course, Hamas uses human shields, so there would still be some collateral damage, but not nearly as much as if you besieged the entire nation, right? This siege is having massive negative consequences, and unfortunately, I think that Hamas is going to do what they can to prevent the siege from being reversed or let up, if you will. Which, honestly, shame on Hamas. Not just for that, but they've done a lot of demonstrable things, but shame on them for that as well.